All right, so in this video, we're going to look at some post-World War II domestic politics in Europe. And we're going to start in Western Europe today. So we're going to look first here at Western Europe. In our next video, we will look at what's going on in Eastern Europe. But here we're going to look at Western Europe, and primarily here we're going to be looking at the UK versus France. So in a lot of ways, and I hope this will become apparent as you watch this video and the next one, what we're going to see after World War II is a lot of the same tensions arise as we saw in 1848. So we're going to see the same kind of tensions. So one set of tensions was kind of liberal versus socialist, and that's what we saw in France in 1848. That's what toppled Louis Philippe. And the other set of tension is nationalist tension. And that's what we saw in the Austrian Empire. So we're going to see these same tensions pop back up, primarily in 1968. But we're going to see these two tensions pop up again. We're going to see this pop up again in France. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to see this nationalist idea pop up, except we're going to see it here in Eastern Europe against the Soviets. But we'll do that in our next video. Both of these things are going to happen in this year, 1968. So let's take a quick look at what's going on in Western Europe. And when we're thinking about Western Europe, we're primarily thinking about the UK and France. So after World War II, and here our focus is again on Western Europe, Western Europe was no longer the world's superpower. So Western Europe was no longer the superpower. They were replaced by the United States. The United States had nuclear weapons, they had the money, and more importantly, they had an uninterrupted economy. So while Britain and France and Germany and the Soviet Union had to rebuild, the Americans didn't. And so they had this uninterrupted economy that could just now run ahead of everybody else. And while most of the countries in Western Europe are all on the same team, there are some subtle differences. Between Great Britain and France, which will lead to some differences in policy. And the biggest difference here is that the UK mostly followed the United States. And France, I guess the best word for this is that they bristled under American leadership. The British were more or less happy to go along with the Americans. The French wanted to go their own way. Still on the same team, but they wanted to do things their own way. So, for instance, both the UK and France had really pervasive social welfare programs. These things were called cradle to the grave welfare programs. So as soon as you were born, you had some sort of government assistance, usually medical assistance, and you had that until you died. These were reactions to socialists. Basically, if you give people the easy stuff the socialists advocate for, all that the socialists have left is the revolution stuff, which, to be honest, most people didn't want. So the British and the French just said, yeah, we'll give you the easy stuff. We'll give you unemployment insurance. We'll give you universal health care. We'll give you child care expenses. We'll give you all of this stuff that the socialists also want. But by doing so, it takes all the wind out of their sails. They don't have anything left to advocate for other than the really revolutionary stuff, which no one really wants. So both the UK and France did that, but here's where the difference is. The UK turned to austerity measures in the 1970s and the 1980s, and that's under Margaret Thatcher. And that basically means that you are cutting services. And you're cutting budgets. And this was an American idea. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan are basically doing the same thing at roughly the same time. France kept their programs. And became more socialist in the 1980s. So that's one difference there. But the big difference that we need to focus on here deals with the military. The UK was pretty happy to let the United States take the lead militarily. Like, they were still involved in everything, but, NATO was an American idea. And the British were happy to go along with it. The French didn't like this. They all had the same idea. They were all opposed to the Soviet Union. But the French were not really all that happy with how the Americans were doing this. And one way we can see this play out is in nuclear weapons. In 1952, the British, with an American head start, got a nuclear weapon. The French didn't get theirs until 1960. The French got theirs on their own, and this was to keep NATO out of French military policy. If the French have their own nuclear weapons, then the French don't have to listen to the Americans and they can do what they like. The really big thing for understanding France, and this is going to pull us into that year of 1968. The thing that we really need to understand about France, though, is the creation of the French Fifth Republic. So the Fourth Republic was created after World War II. And so this Fifth Republic gets rid of the Fourth Republic. And so this is one of those important events in French history that's going to color what's going to happen in the latter half of the 20th century in France. So this story starts in the 1950s. Algeria, which was a department of France, think of it like a state of France. We don't need that second parentheses. Algeria wanted independence. And this was an ongoing trend throughout Africa. That African colonies, or even places in Africa that were considered part of the European metropole, they wanted independence. And in this case, this separatist or nationalist struggle turns violent. And remember, for the French, they don't see this as a struggle for independence. They see this as a civil war, because a piece of France wants to secede. And the war dragged on. So the violence starts in 1954, and it drags on until 1958. And 1958 is an important year because that's when the Fourth Republic collapses. So in 1958, there was a military coup that toppled the government. There were a number of French officers dissatisfied with the war. They thought it should have been over sooner. And they threatened to overthrow the government. That is until a war hero from World War II steps in. Charles de Gaulle, who was the leader of the French resistance during World War II, and he served briefly as prime minister after World War II. Charles de Gaulle was brought back to lead France. He convinced these French army officers to stand down. He convinced the government of the Fourth Republic to resign. And this is where we get the French Fifth Republic. So this happens in 1958. So we get the Fifth Republic, and Charles de Gaulle becomes the new president of France. And he's given a lot of power. One of the criticisms of the Fourth Republic was that the leader didn't have enough power and that it was too decentralized. And so what the Fifth Republic did is give the president a lot more power. And with that, the conflict in Algeria comes to a negotiated settlement. And that finally ends in 1962. I think it's 1962. And de Gaulle is kind of credited for ending this conflict, maybe not quickly, but peacefully. Now, France under de Gaulle was kind of like France under Louis Philippe. So de Gaulle was like a classical liberal. He supported the rights of rich people. He valued corporate rights over worker rights. So he was very much a classical liberal. Now, while that's going on, the people at the bottom of society feel unheard. And these are the people that are more likely to be socialists or communists. They're poor workers, they're students, they're intellectuals. And in early 1968, student protests in Paris started to grow. And they're basically protesting those ideas. Eventually, socialist parties and labor unions joined in and called for a general strike. So a general strike is just a complete work stoppage. Everybody in the country is going to stop working. The city of Paris grinds to a halt. And it looks like the protests might topple de Gaulle the same way that they toppled Louis Philippe. On May 29th, 1968, de Gaulle fled the country because most likely he was afraid of being toppled. The reason he gave was to prevent bloodshed that might be directed at him. So he wanted to keep the peace, and he thought the best way to keep the peace was if he just removed himself from the situation. But he was probably, in the back of his mind, afraid that he was going to get toppled. And the scary part about this is that for about 10 hours, no one knew where the president of France was. But he comes back the next day and was convinced to call new elections. And in these new elections, de Gaulle's party won in a landslide, much the same way that the Prussian conservatives won elections in 1848. Why did de Gaulle's party win in a landslide? Because the election was characterized this way. You were either voting for stability, which is what de Gaulle provided, or you were voting for anarchy and revolution. That's how the election was characterized. You were either voting for stability or revolution. And the French have a long history of revolution, and it doesn't always turn out great for the French. So given the two options, people voted for de Gaulle. But this was pretty much the end of de Gaulle. In 1969, so the next year, de Gaulle resigns. Because even though he won this election, he's lost a lot of popular support. So given the option between de Gaulle and anarchy, people chose de Gaulle. But that doesn't mean that they like de Gaulle. They just don't like anarchy. So he resigns in 1969. He's seen as out of touch. So he's now seen as out of touch. He's kind of seen as authoritarian. These protests were kind of violently pushed back by the French police. So he's kind of seen as an authoritarian. He's seen as anti-American. And so he resigns, and he's replaced by his prime minister. But after his prime minister, in the 1980s, France becomes more socialist. And it might be a reaction to what happened here in 1968. And those people who were protesting finally got it together and elected somebody who would actually put in place the policies they liked. So in our next video, we will cover what was going on the other side of Europe. So if this is the liberal versus socialist conflict of 1848, what we'll see in Eastern Europe are the nationalist struggles that we saw in 1848. Except this time, instead of in Austria, we're going to be talking about countries that are dominated by the Soviets. So that'll be our next video. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.